Ever catch yourself wrestling with a tricky ethical dilemma? Like really trying to figure out the right thing to do? Well, get ready, because today we're diving headfirst into the fascinating world where ethics and psychology collide.
Buckle up.
We're talking about how our minds make sense of right and wrong, and how our understanding of psychology itself can color those judgments.
It's more intertwined than you might think.
Our guide for this deep dive is Calum Neill and his thought-provoking book, Ethics and Psychology Beyond Codes of Practice. It's a real eye-opener, challenging those assumptions we have about good and bad behavior.
Definitely. Gets you thinking, are we born with a moral compass, or is it something we develop along the way?
Exactly. And get this, we're kicking things off with a psychological experiment that really gets the gears turning. You know, that famous Milgram shock experiment.
Oh, Milgram's work, yeah, it's everywhere, become a cultural touchstone almost. It's amazing how one study can spark such debate.
Right. I mean, on one hand, you have someone like Darren Brown interpreting it as this big reveal of human nature, but then Milgram himself, he was much more cautious about drawing such sweeping conclusions.
Goes to show, a single study can really capture the public imagination, often in ways the researcher never intended.
Totally. Makes you wonder how many times we form opinions based on psychological findings without even realizing it, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of which, Neil brings up a really interesting point. You know how codes of conduct became a big thing after Milgram?
Yeah, to protect participants in research, right?
Right, which is crucial, of course. But Neil argues that they kind of sidestep a bigger ethical issue that Milgram's work brought to light. It's not just about protecting people during research, but about the impact of the findings themselves.
Hmm. How so?
Well, these psychological findings, they have this power, to shape our whole worldview, even if we don't realize it's happening. Like, imagine reading a study that says humans are inherently selfish. It might change how you interact with others, even if you don't consciously buy into that belief.
Wow. That's a sobering thought, isn't it? It's like these findings seep into our subconscious and influence our perceptions. Have you ever found yourself changing your view on something because of a study you came across?
Oh, for sure. It's fascinating how our understanding of these studies, even if we just get the gist of it, can really shift our perspective.
For sure. It makes you wonder about the ripple effects.
Mhm.
But if psychology itself is grappling with its own identity, as Neil suggests, then where does that leave us in determining what's actually ethical?
Right. Where do we find that solid ground?
Yeah. It's like, are we just supposed to go with the flow on this one?
Well, Neil argues that psychology's quest to be seen as a hard science has led to this huge focus on the measurable stuff, the brain, neural activity, all that.
Which is important.
Totally, but it often comes at the expense of the mind, the realm of our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings. So the question becomes, if psychology moves away from exploring the mind, what fills that void?
Right. It's like we become data points on a graph instead of these complex beings with inner lives. It's a bit dehumanizing when you think about it that way.
Absolutely. It raises the question, what makes us human if not the richness of our inner world?
So if we're not turning to psychology for all the answers, where do we look for ethical guidance? What about religion or cultural norms? They've been around for centuries.
You're right, they have been our compass for a long time. And Neil digs into that. He acknowledges their limitations, but he also highlights their significance in shaping our understanding of right and wrong. Like, take food prohibitions, for instance. Kosher dietary laws, they hold deep religious and cultural meaning for some, right? But for others, they might seem like arbitrary rules.
Oh, totally. Like growing up, there were certain foods I just wouldn't touch because of my family's beliefs. But now I look back and I'm like, really? It was that big of a deal.
Hmm. It's amazing how these things stick with us, isn't it? Shows how deeply ingrained beliefs, even about something as simple as food, can shape our ethical judgments.
Definitely. But what about this idea of ethics being natural? Are we hardwired for morality? Or is it something we learn? Like, is there something inside us guiding us toward good and bad?
It's an alluring idea that we're born with this innate moral compass. But Neil, he challenges this notion, especially when you look at studies like the Subway Samaritan experiment.
Oh, yeah, the one where they faked a collapse on the train.
That's the one. Even though it seems like a real-world scenario, it's still a carefully controlled experiment. They
Yeah.
use the same route, the same victim, there's a level of artificiality to it. And real life, it's messy, unpredictable. You can't control all the variables.
It's like trying to understand the ocean by looking at a drop of water under a microscope.
Precisely. So, if real life situations are complex, and even our controlled experiments have their limits, where do we even begin to unravel this whole ethical decision making thing?
Right. It's like, how can we trust any of it?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Neil throws us a curveball and brings in a whole new perspective from, get this, Immanuel Kant.
Kant. Now there's a thinker who knows how to shake things up.
Oh, absolutely. Get ready for a wild ride.
Okay, so Kant, he's all about shaking things up in the world of ethics. Where do we even begin with his take on all this?
Well, Kant, he's not so interested in the outcomes, you know? He shifts the focus away from that. He argues that true morality, it's all about the goodwill. It's the intention behind our actions, regardless of the consequences.
Hold on, so you're saying the results don't really matter to him? How can you just disregard the impact of your choices? That seems kind of unrealistic, doesn't it?
Kant would say focusing only on outcomes, it misses the point of what ethical behavior really is. He introduces this thing called the categorical imperative as his guiding principle. Sounds complicated, but we can break it down.
Please do, because honestly, it sounds a bit intimidating.
Right. So basically, it's a test you can use for your actions. You ask yourself, could everyone do this without it causing a contradiction? Like, could this action be universalized?
Okay, I think I need a real world example here. Still a bit fuzzy on how this plays out in real life.
Let's say someone's thinking about stealing. If everybody stole, right, the idea of owning anything would just fall apart. It would be chaos. So that action, it creates a contradiction. But on the other hand, if everyone decided to eat a good breakfast, there's no conflict there. See how it works.
I see where you're going with this. It's about acting in a way that wouldn't cause the whole system to crumble, right? But are we always that rational? I mean, we all make impulsive decisions sometimes.
Yeah.
What about those moments when we just act on pure emotion or desire, even when we know better?
That's a really important point, and Neil dives right into that. You're right. Kant assumes that humans, we operate on logic. But psychology, it shows us a more complicated picture. We're not always driven by reason. Our emotions, our biases, all these unconscious motivations, they come into play. Neil brings up this example of a guy who chooses instant gratification, even though it could have deadly consequences.
Yikes. Like when you know you should order the salad, but that burger is calling your name.
Exactly. It highlights how our decision-making isn't always ruled by logic. We're not robots, right?
Definitely not. But does that totally dismantle Kant's whole emphasis on rational morality? It seems like a pretty big wrench in the gears.
It definitely complicates things. And then Neil, he takes it even further, introduces this mind-blowing concept that the self, that me making these choices, might be more of an illusion than we realize.
Wait, what? Like, are you saying there's no real me in here?
It sounds strange, I know. Think about a time when you acted without thinking, like you were on autopilot.
Oh, sure. Happens all the time.
Neil uses this analogy of a virus. It acts, it spreads, but there's no conscious self driving it. So maybe our sense of self, it's less about this unified, independent being and more like a collection of experiences, drives, influences that are shaping our behavior in ways we might not even fully grasp.
Okay, now that is a lot to unpack. It's kind of freeing in a way, but also a little creepy. If our sense of self is more fluid and less in control than we thought, what does that mean for ethical responsibility? It's like an existential crisis waiting to happen.
It's a big question, for sure, and Neil doesn't shy away from it. He suggests that this realization, while it might make us question everything, it doesn't let us off the hook for our choices. If anything, it adds another layer of complexity to the whole ethical landscape.
So where do we even go from there? If our sense of self is always changing, influenced by things we might not even be aware of, how can we navigate these ethical dilemmas?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Neil, he draws on the wisdom of the poet John Keats here, suggests that we need to embrace what he called negative capability.
Negative capability. Okay, now you have to explain that one because it sounds, well, kind of negative.
It's not negative in a bad way. It's more about being okay with not knowing everything. It's that ability to sit with uncertainty, to resist the need to have all the answers or these rigid frameworks for everything.
I can get behind that. It's easy to get overwhelmed, especially in today's world where there's just so much information coming at you all the time.
Absolutely. And we think if we just gather enough information, we'll finally figure it all out. But sometimes the most insightful approach is to acknowledge that there are limits to what we can know.
I like that. It's very freeing, actually. But how does this tie back to ethics? I mean, it's one thing to embrace uncertainty in our personal lives, but when it comes to making moral decisions, don't we need some kind of guidelines?
Think about it this way. Remember our discussion about psychology trying to fit into that hard science box?
Yeah, focusing on what can be measured.
Right. And by doing that, by only valuing the measurables, we risk overlooking the richness and complexity of our subjective experiences. Maybe, as Neil argues, true psychology is more like poetry than a textbook.
Whoa, psychology is poetry. That's a beautiful way to put it.
Right. It embraces the ambiguity, the metaphor, those things that capture what it means to be human. And through that lens, our ethical frameworks, they become less about following a rigid set of rules and more about understanding how our every action shapes who we are, who we're becoming.
So it's not about finding the right answer in a book, but about understanding that every choice, every action, it all contributes to who we are and the world we're creating.
Precisely. It's an ongoing process of self-reflection, of ethical engagement. And within that process, there's room for growth, for learning, for constantly striving to live in a way that aligns with our values. It's a journey, not a destination.
So we're talking about leaning into uncertainty when it comes to psychology and ethics. It's a lot to wrap your head around. On one hand, it's kind of a relief to accept that we might not have all the answers. But on the other hand, how do we actually make ethical choices when there's no clear-cut roadmap?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Neil, he turns to a pretty unexpected source for an answer. He brings in the poet John Keats.
A poet. To answer a question about ethics. Okay, I'm intrigued, but a little lost.
So Keats, he talked about this idea of negative capability, and Neil picks up on that. It's this ability to be comfortable with not knowing everything, to resist that urge to grasp for easy answers or these rigid rules for every situation. We live in a world obsessed with information, and it's so tempting to think that if we just gather enough of it, we'll finally have it all figured out.
Ugh, tell me about it. Information overload is real.
Mm.
So are you saying it's more insightful to just admit that there are some things we may never fully understand?
In a way, yes. It's about acknowledging those limits to our knowing. And when you think about it, it's incredibly freeing.
It is freeing.
Yeah.
But how does this apply to ethics? Like, it's one thing to embrace uncertainty in your personal life, but don't we need some kind of guidelines when it comes to making moral decisions?
Remember when we talked about psychology trying so hard to fit into that hard science category?
Yeah, putting so much emphasis on what's measurable, quantifiable.
Exactly. But by focusing solely on what we can measure, we might be missing out on something crucial. We might be overlooking the richness and complexity of our subjective experiences. What if, as Neil suggests, true psychology, it's not about cold, hard data? What if it's more like poetry?
Psychology is poetry. I like that. There's a certain beauty to that idea.
Right. Poetry, it embraces ambiguity, it uses metaphor, it gets at those things that are hard to put into words. And if we look at psychology through that lens, then our ethical frameworks, they become less about following a set of predetermined rules.
It becomes more about understanding the impact of our choices, how our actions shape who we are, who we're becoming. It's a much more nuanced way of looking at it.
Exactly. And it makes every choice more significant, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's not just about checking off boxes. It's about understanding that our actions have a ripple effect. They contribute to something larger than ourselves.
It's a continuous process, self-reflection, ethical engagement, and within that process, there's always room to grow, to learn from our mistakes, and to strive to live in a way that aligns with our values.
And that journey, that ongoing process of striving, it's never really over, is it?
Never over. And that's what makes it so challenging, but also so incredibly meaningful.
This has been quite a deep dive, and I hope our listeners are feeling as energized by these ideas as I am. We've journeyed from those big ethical questions in psychological research all the way to this idea of embracing the unknown, that negative capability.
And through it all, we've barely scratched the surface. Calum Neill's book, it goes so much deeper, offering a truly thought-provoking exploration of how ethics and psychology intersect. If any of this resonated with you today, do yourself a favor and check it out.
Yes. But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on. If psychology, as Neil suggests, is more about exploring the human experience and delivering definitive answers, what does that mean for how you approach ethical questions in your own life? Keep those minds open, keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.